the reason I did it was because of the tips. I made a lot of money. It was great. My daughter was a waitress, server this year.
Yes, server.
Made a lot of tips. The reason that's a big complaint now is it was never something where it was really tracked before. So people were keeping that money and not paying tips. Now everything's electronic. You get paid out on your tips. And people are mad because they feel like they took a pay cut because they were never paying on the tips that were coming in before and weren't being tracked. My biggest problem with this is what it does for other employees who aren't. And I'm not talking a lot of others, but
teachers, nurses.
Well, I have a special needs daughter. They have aides who are one-to-one aides. They make $16 an hour, maybe, sometimes less. And now you're going to have an incentive for them to go do other jobs, to go get tip jobs instead of doing the jobs where, you know, it just creates, it's the unintended consequences.
Yeah, look,
what happens to that?
I get that argument, and I am a fan of broad-based tax reform. I think low taxes, you know, you're mentioning different professions. Look, I think that's one of the big things at stake in this election and the difference between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. You know, the Wall Street Journal calls this election the $6 trillion election because that's the delta between how much taxes will go up versus going down or being cut more. You'll recall when I ran for president, I ran on a simple flat tax of 16% simple flat tax for business, 10% simple flat tax for families and individuals. I think simplicity is a great approach to tax reform. But at the same time, I don't think the perfect should be the enemy of the good. And when you deal with tipped employees, there are often people who are struggling. They're struggling to raise young kids.
There's a lot of employees who are W-2 employees who are struggling, too.
Sure, and I'm for cutting their taxes, too.
When we went through the process of raising minimum wage at places like Walmart, Target, the fast food restaurants in California now, you can make $20 an hour for doing some of these things. It's great for the employees who are there, but it really draws from the other areas where they can't pay that same amount. It would make more sense to me to raise the earned income tax credit so that anybody making below a certain level can get taxes off. You know, it just seems like a fairer way of going about it that does not create those unintended consequences.
So what I would say is what California is doing, I think, is exactly backwards, where they jacked the minimum wage up so high that you're seeing restaurants going out of business. You're seeing restaurants laying people off. You're seeing pizza delivery.
This is essentially a tax. This is essentially a wage increase for workers in certain jobs and not in others.
Right, but it's not coming out of the hide of the employer, so nobody will lose their job because of no taxes on tips. No business will go out of business. California's idea.
Shortages in other jobs where they're not making tips. Everybody's going to want to be paid in a tip basis.
So that argument I actually think is specious. The thing that everyone will get paid on tips. Let me tell you why, actually, because it gets said a lot. But look, the IRS already defines tax fraud. So you can't have a lawyer who says instead of an hourly bill, I just have my whole compensation on tips. You get prosecuted for that because that's not a cash tip.
Let's go back to the point that I think you agree with me on, which is that this creates an unfair standard so that not everybody is getting the same basis, even though if you're making that same amount somewhere else, but you're not getting paid in tips. And I'm not talking about extending this for everybody, for lawyers or other people who are certainly doing fine. What I'm talking about is for people who don't make enough money and the inequity that is going to create in those spaces and how hard it's going to be to find workers in those spaces, which a lot of times, if they're nurses' aides, if they're teachers' aides, if they're doing the work that these people are doing God's work. And it creates a huge inequity. And as somebody who has tried to find people here and the huge turnover you see in those areas, it's heartbreaking.
Look, that's why I'm for cutting taxes. And